It's August 9th, 2026, and after a brief window where it genuinely looked like this war might be winding down, the entire region has erupted again on multiple fronts simultaneously, and it's worth taking a moment to actually absorb just how many separate crises are colliding at once right now rather than treating each one as its own isolated headline. Iran has formally announced it is not negotiating with the United States, submitting instead a list of demands for reopening the Strait of Hormuz and reshuffling its own top security leadership in the process. At the exact same time, massive explosions have torn through southern Lebanon near the historic Beaufort Castle. Houthi rebels in Yemen have claimed fresh strikes against Saudi Arabian forces and a major oil refinery, and a tanker was reportedly struck by an unidentified projectile off the coast of Oman. This isn't one crisis. This is 4 or 5 separate flashpoints all reigniting within the same 72-hour window. And it's happening at the precise moment the world thought Iran was finally close to accepting a deal that would end the fighting for good. Here's what I need you to understand about what just happened. Because the timing here isn't a coincidence at all. It's a clear signal about exactly who inside Iran's fractured leadership structure is currently winning the argument over how this war ends. Let's walk through exactly what's on the table right now, because there's a lot of moving pieces and they all matter. Just days ago, President Trump said negotiations with Iran were set to begin after he personally canceled what would have been one of the harshest bombing campaigns launched against Iran to date, a joint American and Israeli operation aimed squarely at Iran's remaining energy infrastructure that Trump himself described as potentially the biggest attack since World War II. He said the deal being discussed would include the immediate, complete, and total opening of the Strait of Hormuz and an end to Iran's nuclear threat, and credited pressure from Gulf allies Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates for convincing him to hold off, a rare moment of regional powers visibly shaping the American president's own military decision-making in real time. For a moment, it looked like real progress. Then, within days, everything shifted, in a reversal sharp enough to catch even seasoned regional analysts off guard. Iran's Supreme National Security Council issued a sweeping list of conditions, demanding the United States lift its naval blockade, end sanctions, release frozen Iranian assets, formally end the war, and pay restitution for damages before Tehran would even consider reopening the strait. Oil futures rose more than 1% after Tehran confirmed it wasn't actually engaging in negotiations with Washington at all, contradicting the more optimistic tone coming out of the White House just days earlier, a market reaction that itself tells you how much weight traders now place on Iran's public posture as a real, tradable signal of where this war is actually headed. Before we go deeper into why this reversal happened right now, and how it connects to explosions happening simultaneously in Lebanon, Yemen, and the waters off Oman, if you're finding this breakdown useful in cutting through what is honestly one of the most confusing and fast-moving weeks of this entire war, take a second to drop a comment with your read on where this goes next. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because there is a tremendous amount to track right now, and it's only getting more complicated by the day. Let's rewind the broader picture first, because you need the full context to understand why this particular moment feels like such a sharp reversal. This war began on February 28th, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise strike that killed Iran's supreme leader, along with dozens of senior commanders in a single devastating night. Iran responded by trying to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway carrying roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas supply, effectively shutting it down through mines, boardings, and direct attacks on shipping. What followed was 5 straight months of an exhausting cycle, ceasefires negotiated and then broken, ceasefires extended and then collapsing again, a naval blockade of Iranian ports that gutted Iran's oil export revenue down to almost nothing, and repeated moments where the war appeared to be reaching a resolution only to blow apart again within days. If you actually trace the calendar of this war, the whiplash becomes almost dizzying to lay out in sequence. Early March brought Iran's closure of the strait and the initial oil price shock. April brought apocalyptic warnings from Washington, followed within hours by a negotiated ceasefire, a ceasefire that nearly collapsed on its own before being extended at the last possible moment. Mid-April brought the first naval blockade of Iranian ports. May brought the first hard data showing Iran's oil exports essentially collapsing to nothing. June brought another maximalist American threat targeting Iran's oil infrastructure directly, canceled again at the final hour after Tehran signaled it was ready to talk, only for that same ceasefire framework to collapse by the end of the month after Iran attacked commercial vessels using the exact shipping routes both sides had just agreed on. July brought a reimposed blockade and 13 consecutive nights of American strikes, followed by an unexpected pause. And now, in the first weeks of August, you have the single largest canceled operation of the entire war, described by the president himself as potentially the biggest attack since World War II, followed within days by Iran's own government publicly rejecting the very talks that cancellation was supposed to protect. The pattern has been so consistent throughout this entire conflict. that it's almost become predictable. Maximum pressure applied right up to the edge of a devastating new campaign. A last-minute pullback justified by claims of diplomatic breakthrough, and then, within a week or two, some new provocation drags everything back toward confrontation. What makes this particular reversal so significant is the scale of what got canceled just before it happened. Trump wasn't threatening another routine round of strikes. He was describing an operation aimed at completely finishing off what remained of Iran's oil and energy infrastructure, the kind of attack that would have taken the country's economy, already reeling from months of blockade, and pushed it into something close to total collapse. Holding that back specifically to give negotiations room to breathe was an enormous gesture of good faith, or at least strategic patience, and Iran's response within days was to publicly declare it wasn't even talking to Washington at all. That reversal makes a lot more sense once you understand what happened inside Iran's own government at almost the exact same moment. Iran's supreme leader replaced his national security chief, removing Mohammad Bagher Zolghadr, the official who had issued that sweeping list of demands just days earlier, and installing Mohsen Rezaieh, described by analysts as a regime stalwart with deep, long-standing ties to the Revolutionary Guard, in his place. Think about what that timing actually tells you. The demands list didn't cost Zolghadr his job, if anything. Replacing him with someone even more closely aligned with the IRGC's hardline wing suggests Tehran's leadership wanted someone even less inclined toward compromise sitting in that chair, heading into whatever comes next. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, the man who had actually been doing the diplomatic legwork with Trump's special envoy earlier in the war, is increasingly being described by regional analysts as sidelined, eclipsed by officials closer to the IRGC and to the new supreme leader himself. That's the same internal fracture we've tracked throughout this entire conflict, playing out again in real time, except this time the hardline faction appears to have just won a significant round. It's worth understanding exactly who Mohsen Rezaieh actually is within Iran's political and military establishment, because his background tells you a lot about what this appointment signals. Rezaieh has spent decades as one of the most recognizable faces of the Revolutionary Guard's old guard, a figure who has run for president multiple times over the years, always positioning himself as a defender of the revolution's founding military and ideological principles, rather than as a reformer or a technocrat interested in negotiated accommodation with the West. Installing someone with that specific profile into the role responsible for national security strategy, at the exact moment Iran's economy is at its most vulnerable point of the entire war, is not the kind of personnel decision a government makes if it's preparing to pursue a softer, more conciliatory posture toward Washington. It's the kind of decision a government makes when the internal political consensus has shifted toward believing that further concessions carry more risk to regime stability than continued confrontation does, regardless of what the underlying economic data actually says about how sustainable that confrontation really is. There's also something worth noting about Araghchi's position specifically, because his trajectory over the course of this war tells its own story about how much ground Iran's diplomatic wing has lost. He was appointed foreign minister back in 2024 with an explicit mandate to secure sanctions relief, and he spent months negotiating directly with Trump's special envoy over Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, talks that ultimately failed before this war even began. Throughout the opening months of this conflict, dozens of senior Iranian officials were assassinated in targeted airstrikes, yet Araghchi notably was not among them. A detail analysts have interpreted as a sign that even the American and Israeli intelligence services running this campaign viewed him as a potential interlocutor worth preserving for eventual settlement talks. That makes his current marginalization inside Tehran's own decision-making structure even more telling, because it means the very official the outside world may have been counting on as the eventual bridge to a negotiated peace is losing influence internally at precisely the moment that bridge would have mattered most. I want to pause here for a second, because if this level of detail about the internal power struggle inside Iran's government is helping you understand why this war keeps swinging so wildly between diplomacy and escalation, that's exactly the kind of context that gets lost in day-to-day headlines. So drop a comment with what you want to see covered next, and share this with anyone trying to actually follow what's happening across the region right now. Let's talk about Lebanon, because the explosions there over the past week and a half have been genuinely staggering in scale, and they tell you a lot about how fragile every single ceasefire in this broader regional conflict actually is. Israel accused Hezbollah of violating its own ceasefire agreement by launching an explosive-laden drone at an Israeli military engineering vehicle in southern Lebanon, describing it as the group's first attack of its kind in more than a month. In response, Israeli forces detonated approximately 700 tons of explosives beneath the Beaufort Ridge, an area historically significant enough that it's home to the UNESCO-listed Beaufort Castle, destroying what officials described as a major section of an underground tunnel network that Hezbollah had built over roughly 2 decades specifically to enable infiltration into Israeli territory. The blast was so massive that residents as far away as Sidon in the outskirts of Beirut described feeling tremors like an earthquake, with windows shattering in nearby towns, and the visible landscape of the ridge itself reportedly changed by the force of the detonation. Local residents described the experience in genuinely dramatic terms, with one woman living near the site telling reporters she'd lived through previous rounds of airstrikes and artillery shelling without ever leaving her town, but that this specific night felt different, the ground shaking violently beneath her like an actual earthquake before the sound of the explosions even reached her. That kind of first-hand account gives you a sense of just how disproportionate this response was compared to the incident that triggered it. A single drone strike on an unmanned engineering vehicle answered with what may be one of the largest single demolition operations Israel has carried out in southern Lebanon throughout this entire multi-year conflict with Hezbollah. Israeli forces also struck caves and structures near several nearby towns in the same operation, and separately shelled a different hillside position with incendiary rounds, sparking fires across the area in what appears to be a broader, sustained campaign against Hezbollah's remaining infrastructure rather than an isolated one-time response. This wasn't the first time the specific tunnel network had been targeted either. Israeli forces had already destroyed one section of it back in mid-July, and officials say they continue monitoring an entirely separate Hezbollah tunnel system beneath a different ridge nearby, believed to still house dozens of operatives. Lebanon's president warned publicly that these detonations threatened the broader ceasefire framework Lebanon had worked to establish with Israel, calling the strikes near the castle a direct threat to that recent agreement, while Lebanon's culture ministry raised concerns about potential damage to the historic castle itself, though officials said a full assessment wasn't possible while the site remained under Israeli military control. The scale of the demolition even drew attention from cultural heritage advocates, with calls emerging for UNESCO itself to investigate potential damage to a site with that level of historical protection, adding an unusual cultural dimension to what is fundamentally a military and security story. What makes this front so significant in the context of everything else happening this week is that it demonstrates just how interconnected Iran's entire regional proxy network actually is. Hezbollah doesn't operate independently of Tehran. It's funded, armed, and to a significant degree directed by the same regime currently reshuffling its leadership in favor of hardliners and walking away from talks with Washington. A flare-up in Lebanon at this exact moment isn't a coincidence. It's a reflection of the same broader posture shift happening across every front Iran has influence over simultaneously. Even Lebanese officials have publicly acknowledged the extent to which local political and militia dynamics remain tethered to instructions coming out of Tehran, with reporting suggesting that key domestic Lebanese political figures continue coordinating closely with what's described as their Iranian patrons, even as the broader war grinds on hundreds of miles away in the Gulf. Then there's Yemen, where the Houthis, Iran's most reliable and most consistently active proxy force throughout this entire war, claimed fresh strikes this week against Saudi Arabian military positions, and more significantly, against a major oil refinery inside Saudi territory. Targeting energy infrastructure directly inside Saudi Arabia is a serious escalation, not just a continuation of the harassment campaign the Houthis have been running against shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait for months. Saudi Arabia has spent enormous effort trying to stay outside the direct line of fire in this broader Iran conflict, hosting mediation efforts and quietly lobbying Washington toward de-escalation rather than further strikes, and a direct attack on its own energy infrastructure by an Iranian-backed proxy force is exactly the kind of provocation that risks pulling the Saudis into a far more active role in this war than they've wanted throughout the past 5 months. It's worth remembering that Saudi Arabia's restraint throughout this entire conflict has been a deliberate, carefully managed policy choice, not an accident of circumstance. Riyadh has watched Iran's economy collapse under the weight of the American blockade, and clearly calculated that staying largely on the sidelines, providing quiet diplomatic support while avoiding direct military entanglement, served its interests better than actively joining the fight. That calculation gets a lot harder to maintain once your own refineries and your own military positions start taking direct hits from Iranian proxies. If these Houthi strikes continue or escalate further, you should expect increasingly forceful statements out of Riyadh and potentially a shift away from the cautious, mediator-focused posture Saudi Arabia has maintained since this war began, towards something closer to direct retaliation against Houthi positions in Yemen, which would open yet another active front in a conflict that already stretches from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. And then, almost as if to complete the picture, a commercial tanker was reportedly struck by an unidentified projectile while transiting waters near Oman, according to maritime security monitors tracking shipping in the region. Oman, remember, is the one country that's been serving as the primary mediator between Iran and the United States throughout this entire negotiation process. The country whose territorial waters were specifically being discussed as part of the proposed safe shipping corridor through the Strait of Hormuz. An attack anywhere near Omani waters, at the exact moment Oman is trying to broker a deal that Iran's own Security Council just publicly walked away from, sends an unmistakable message about how little control Tehran's diplomatic wing currently has over what's actually happening in the water, regardless of what any official statement out of the foreign ministry claims. Think about how uncomfortable a position this puts Oman in specifically, because Muscat has staked a significant amount of its own diplomatic credibility on successfully brokering an arrangement between two governments that don't trust each other and increasingly can't even agree internally on their own negotiating positions. Every incident like this, a tanker struck near Omani waters while talks are supposedly ongoing, chips away at Oman's ability to credibly claim it, can actually deliver a stable, enforceable agreement. If the country serving as the primary bridge between Washington and Tehran starts losing confidence that any deal it helps broker will actually hold, given how many previous ceasefires and frameworks have collapsed within weeks of being signed, that bridge itself becomes less reliable, and the entire diplomatic architecture this war has depended on for any hope of resolution starts to look considerably shakier than it did even just a week ago. Let's talk about why all of this is happening at the same moment, because I don't think it's a coincidence that Lebanon, Yemen, and the waters off Oman all lit up within days of Iran's own security leadership shifting toward the IRGC's hardline wing. When a regime installs someone like Riyadh, deeply embedded in Revolutionary Guard culture and thinking, into the position responsible for national security strategy, you should expect exactly this kind of coordinated posture shift across every front that regime has influence over. Proxies don't escalate in isolation from what's happening in Tehran. They escalate, or stand down, largely in response to the signals coming from the security apparatus directing them. The fact that Hezbollah, the Houthis, and whatever force struck that tanker near Oman all became more active within the same narrow window that Iran's own Security Council was publicly rejecting negotiations tells you this is a coordinated posture, not a series of unrelated coincidences. There's also a domestic political logic behind this that's worth understanding, because it explains why Iran's leadership might choose escalation at the exact moment its economy is at its most fragile point of the entire war. Zolgadar's demands list, before he was even replaced, explicitly framed itself as representing what he called the demands of the Iranian people after 160 days of what he described as steadfast resistance in the streets and in the field. That kind of language isn't really aimed at Washington. It's aimed inward, at an Iranian public that has watched its currency collapse, its oil exports crater, and its military leadership decimated, and that the regime desperately needs to convince it hasn't simply surrendered. Escalating on multiple fronts simultaneously, even while the economy keeps bleeding, serves that same internal political purpose, projecting strength and defiance to a domestic audience that the regime cannot afford to let believe this war has been a total loss, regardless of what the actual underlying economic and military reality looks like. That internal political calculation matters even more given how the war actually started. A regime that lost dozens of its most senior commanders and its own supreme leader in a single devastating night back in February cannot afford, politically or psychologically, to be seen capitulating on top of that loss just months later. Every escalatory move, every hardline appointment, every proxy strike happening right now serves a dual purpose, applying whatever remaining pressure Iran can still generate against its adversaries, while simultaneously reassuring a traumatized domestic security and political establishment that the regime hasn't been broken by everything it's absorbed since the war began. Understanding that psychological dimension is just as important as understanding the raw economic and military numbers, because it explains behavior that would otherwise look completely irrational. A government continuing to escalate a war it is visibly losing on almost every measurable economic front. Let's talk about how Washington appears to be responding to this reversal, because it tells you something important about where American strategy actually stands right now. Trump himself signaled a shift in emphasis during a recent interview, saying the administration was, in his words, low-keying negotiations with Iran for the time being, and instead putting more weight on increasing economic pressure. That's a notable tonal shift from where things stood just a week earlier, when he was actively canceling a massive planned strike specifically to give diplomacy room to work. It suggests that after watching Iran's Security Council publicly reject talks and reshuffle toward hardliners within days of that gesture, the administration has concluded that further diplomatic overtures aren't likely to produce results right now, and that the more productive path forward is simply letting the existing blockade and sanctions regime continue grinding down Iran's economy rather than offering additional concessions to a government that just demonstrated it isn't currently prepared to reciprocate. There's also been a quieter but significant development on the American side worth noting, with reports indicating the Pentagon has been asking major defense contractors to increase production of munitions and related equipment, a sign that regardless of the diplomatic back and forth, Military planners are preparing for the possibility that this conflict continues for a meaningfully longer stretch than anyone hoped just a few weeks ago. That's not necessarily a signal of imminent new strikes, but it is a clear signal that nobody inside the American defense establishment is treating this week's escalation as a temporary blip that resolves itself quickly. When you're asking industry to ramp up production, you're planning for sustained operational tempo, not a short-term flare-up that gets resolved by next week's headlines. Think about what that request actually implies from a planning perspective. Munitions production isn't something you scale up overnight. It takes months to expand manufacturing capacity, source raw materials, and actually get finished precision-guided weapons off assembly lines and into military stockpiles. A request like that reflects an assessment made weeks or months in advance, anticipating that whatever stockpiles were used during the earlier, more intensive phases of this war, including that 13-night stretch of continuous strikes back in July, need to be replenished not just to current levels, but to levels sufficient for another extended campaign if talks continue to collapse the way they have this week. That's a very different signal than public statements about low-keying negotiations or applying economic pressure, because logistics planning tends to reflect what military leadership actually expects to happen, rather than what officials are saying publicly for diplomatic purposes in any given news cycle. Let's widen the lens for a moment and talk about what this all means for the broader trajectory of the war. Because it's easy to get lost in the individual explosions and individual statements without stepping back to see the shape of the whole picture. What we're really watching right now is a moment where the moderate, diplomatically inclined wing of Iran's government, the one that had been quietly working toward a Hormuz agreement with Oman, that had been engaging, however contentiously, with American negotiators earlier in the war, appears to have lost significant ground to the hardline security apparatus that has never believed negotiation was the right strategy in the first place. That shift didn't happen because the moderates were wrong about the economics. Iran's economy is genuinely in crisis. Oil exports have collapsed. Inflation is running close to 70%, and the currency has lost most of its value since this war began. It happened because, inside a regime built around projecting strength and refusing to appear weak in front of its own population and its own security establishment, the political cost of being seen as capitulating apparently outweighed the economic cost of continuing to fight, at least for now, at least among the faction that currently holds the most influence over Tehran's actual behavior. So let's talk honestly about where this actually goes from here, because there's a real range of outcomes worth considering rather than assuming the worst case is automatically the most likely one. The first possibility is that this is a temporary hardline surge, similar to previous moments throughout this war where escalatory rhetoric and proxy attacks spiked right before a real diplomatic breakthrough. Essentially a final show of strength before the underlying economic pressure forces Tehran back toward the negotiating table within weeks rather than months. Given how many times this exact pattern has played out already this year, ceasefire, collapse, escalation, renewed talks, that's not an unreasonable read of what's happening right now. The second possibility is considerably darker, that Rezaei's appointment represents a genuine, lasting shift in who controls Iran's strategic direction. Not a temporary hardline moment, but an actual reorientation of the regime toward sustained confrontation regardless of the economic cost. Betting that Iran can outlast American political patience the way it's tried to outlast sanctions for decades, even as the country's economy continues collapsing underneath that strategy. If that's what's actually happening, you should expect continued escalation across Lebanon, Yemen, and the Gulf. More incidents like the tanker strike off Oman, and a much longer runway before any genuine resolution becomes possible. The third possibility, and probably the most realistic given everything we've watched over the past 5 months, is that we're looking at another cycle of the same pattern that's defined this entire war. A period of escalation and multi-front provocation that eventually exhausts itself, not because Iran's hardliners have a change of heart, but because the accumulated economic damage, the isolation, and the pressure from regional mediators like Oman and Qatar eventually forces even the hardline faction to accept that some kind of negotiated arrangement is less costly than continuing to fight on every front simultaneously. That's not a clean resolution, but it fits the actual shape of this conflict far better than either a quick breakthrough or a permanent shift toward all-out confrontation. What's clear, regardless of which path this takes, is that the multiple explosions ripping across this region right now, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and in the waters near Oman, are not isolated incidents happening to coincide with Iran's diplomatic reversal. They're the direct, visible expression of a power struggle happening inside Tehran itself. One where the faction currently in control has decided that projecting strength across every front, it can reach matters more right now than accepting a deal that would have ended the economic bleeding this war has caused. Whether that calculation holds up over the coming weeks, or whether the same economic pressure that's already brought Iran's oil exports to near zero eventually forces even the hardliners back to the table, is going to be the defining question of this next chapter of the war. There's a broader pattern worth remembering here too, because this war has taught a fairly consistent lesson about how these regional escalations actually unfold. Every single previous flare-up throughout this conflict, going back to the very first days in February, has eventually given way to renewed diplomatic contact, even after periods that looked in the moment like the entire process had permanently collapsed. That doesn't mean this particular escalation resolves itself the same way automatically, but it does mean the base rate for betting against any diplomacy ever resuming has been wrong every single time it's been tried so far this year. The more useful question probably isn't whether talks eventually restart in some form, but how much additional damage, economic, human, and political, accumulates across Lebanon, Yemen, and the Gulf before whichever faction inside Tehran currently holds the upper hand decides the cost of continuing to fight on every front finally outweighs the political benefit of appearing unbroken. So that's where things stand right now. A region on fire across multiple fronts simultaneously. A regime in Tehran that just handed more power to the faction least interested in compromise. And a diplomatic process that looked close to a breakthrough just days ago now sitting essentially frozen while explosions keep reshaping the map from Lebanon to Yemen to the waters off Oman. 5 months into this war, the lesson keeps repeating itself. Every step forward comes paired with a step back. And the only real question left is how many more of these cycles this region can absorb before something finally gives for good. I want to know what you think happens next. Do you think this is a temporary hardline surge that burns itself out within weeks? Or do you think Iran has genuinely shifted toward a longer, more confrontational path regardless of the cost? Let me know in the comments. Share this with anyone trying to keep up with everything happening across the region right now. And make sure you're subscribed because this story is moving incredibly fast. And there's a lot more still to come. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.